Investigations in other cities have shown that boys 13, 14, even younger are coerced into prostitution with threats of physical violence and are sometimes shipped across state lines, shipped to the older adult men who desire young boys for sexual acts. Occasionally, these boys' episodes with their older clients ends in physical violence. There are men who seek young boys to torture and sometimes to kill.
This phenomenon is not unique to America. It may not even be unique to advanced industrial urban societies. In the other places where it occurs, though, it doesn't seem to be attended by a high level of mayhemic violence. In the United States, it is.
In Islamic countries, for instance, prostitution with boys is a standard. I've been in Morocco and Algeria and observed this, and yet I've never heard any stories of violence being involved. In other words, it's an erotic phenomenon as opposed to this power or psychological.
Well, there are those who would have us believe that that is the case in America. Here, for instance, is an article written by a law professor in Washington, D.C., who was general counsel to the Metropolitan Police Department. This article was written in 1981. He says, if the boys are victims, it is largely in the technical sense. It is more accurate to characterize them as entrepreneurs who by and large understand their own motivations. They do it for money, for drugs, for pleasure, and perhaps for some as a crude gambit for emotional sustenance. But unlike teenage girl prostitutes, they do not act out of fear. There is no coerced recruitment, no whippings, no incarcerations in their rooms, and no sweet-talking pimps with Cadillacs. That's not what I have found.
So you think that's false, that Washington police chief?
I think it's false, and I think it's a deliberate falsehood.
Mm. Well, let's talk about, we haven't talked about the proliferation in the United States of this. We've talked about a few individual cases. How widespread is it, and what are the numbers we're talking about?
Well, we know this, for instance. This is a standard. 500,000 kids run away or are thrown out of homes every year in the United States, and the majority of them are boys. Another thing that the President's Commission on Obscenity found, this is the commission that Richard Nixon repudiated, it mentioned in passing that child pornography was a phenomenon of the abuse of children, and then went on to say that for every female prostitute of any age in the United States, there are 9 boys underage who are prostitutes. That is a finding which is debatable and is a speculation, but it went unnoticed. I think, though, that if you get in a car and prowl the streets of the capitals of this practice, Houston, New Orleans, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and to a much lesser extent, Austin, our state capital, and Washington, the nation's capital, you'll find that boys are the ones hustling more than the women.
Mark, some of the research that you did in Austin here that started off your involvement in this issue indicated that there was a possible ring of homosexual boys in Austin. Could you tell some of the facts on this case?
Well, my interest in this whole issue originated when, as a reporter for the Daily Texan, we heard through the grapevine that a pharmacist here in town had been busted. And I don't remember the original charge. I'm not sure if it was
abuse of a boy in a home.
I guess it was abuse of a, that's right, abuse of a boy in a halfway house. Well, the thing that interested us about the case was that the police had later found in his home a file, an index file, of anywhere from 200 to 500 names of young boys around the Travis County area and counties accompanying Travis County. And it had their names, phone numbers, parents' names, in many cases, sexual statistics on the personnel, height, age, weight, and in some cases preferences. And that sounded like an astounding thing to us, that there should be somebody traveling around, and what he did was he would hang out at high schools and offer the drugs that he had available, as he was a pharmacist, in exchange for sexual favors. Well, we followed that up, and somewhere down the line of judicial scrutiny, the entire the evidence was lost or disappeared or was unable to be retracted. And it complicates from there, but that's how we got.
Well, Anderson, his name was Anderson, Robert Anderson. He was found guilty of one charge and sentenced to 2 years in prison. And then he skipped. He was still not incarcerated. He skipped, and he's never been found again.
Was there any indication that he was involved with other men who were participating in these favors? In other words, what would the point of him keeping these cards be, unless there was some sort of business or organization?
He was an agent. He was an agent, and he had quantities of drugs. Mark didn't mention that he listed next to the name of each boy that boy's personal drug preference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he also had a very large quantity of muscle relaxants to administer to boys to make sex easier for the men.
Not only that, but there was also the names of several well-known business men in the Texas community that, for obvious reasons, were contacts.
Okay, what about, you talked about Boy Scout groups and boys' homes. What about these?
Well, a boys' home is an ideal place if you want to get in on an operation and get hold of some vulnerable kids. It's an ideal place to do it. In San Antonio this August, 2 men who were supposed to be Catholic priests were arrested for sodomizing 50 boys, ages 3½ to 14, that year, and they had several hundred boys in the past 3 years. They're having sex with the boys on a regular basis. That was why they established the home, to get at little boys. In Dallas, a place was closed down the year before. In Houston, Jimmy was in a home in Houston for a while, and he was raped by his caretaker. That place was closed down. In Houston, there are only 42 beds available in all the homes for boys in the whole city, and one of the homes that's still open was previously investigated, and arrests were made because of attacks on the boys. It's very common. It's very hard to trust any place that presents itself as a home for boys. And one of the tragedies of that is when somebody opens one that is clean, like Covenant House in New York City, operated by Father Bruce Ritter, the first thing that happens is there's a smear campaign against it, and everybody says it's dirty too. So if there's a clean one, it gets a bad name. The object is that to make it impossible to tell the good ones from the bad ones.
I guess the Boy Scout people have this problem too, don't
Yes, we've mentioned a couple of Boy Scout rings. That doesn't mean that the Boy Scouts
Right.
are an organized group to feed pederasts. Yes,
What about judges and police?
Judges and police are in high-pressure
And they're
professions
involved
too.
in some of these too, then.
To my knowledge, the police are involved less as practitioners of this than the other stressful professions, by far.
We mentioned...
I should have mentioned the clergy. With all regret, the clergy is highly susceptible to this. Real priests, not just bogus priests like those in San Antonio.